My name is Lord Admiral Veskarun Talmira, and the moment I stopped laughing was the moment I understood that my civilization was already dead. The warning klaxons tore through the command deck of my flagship, the Crown of Seven Suns, as another wave of enemy vessels tore into our outer defense grid. 30,000 years of Zethari military doctrine shattered in less than 90 seconds. I watched it happen on my command display, and I could not move. I could not speak. I could only stand there, my four hands frozen above the tactical console, while officers around me shouted orders that meant nothing anymore. The HFY had returned, and this time they had come with something new. A spore weapon, invisible, silent. It moved through our ventilation systems before our sensors even registered it. My second-in-command, Admiral Threxel, dropped to the deck beside me, his breathing turning wet and ragged within moments. I watched my oldest friend, a being I had fought beside for 800 cycles, struggle to lift his head. His eyes met mine. He tried to speak. He could not. I keyed the emergency seal on my environmental suit, a privilege reserved for the high nobility, and I watched my bridge crew fall one by one. Not all of them. The humans survived. Every single human on my bridge remained standing. Captain Alina Voss was the first to reach Admiral Threxel. She pulled a medical injector from her belt and pressed it against his neck before I could even issue the order. Her movements were calm, practiced. She had done this before, on worlds I had never heard of, against enemies I had never faced. "My lord," she said, looking up at me with those strange human eyes, "we need to move. The HFY are 3 minutes from boarding range." I should have been giving the orders. I was the Lord Admiral. I commanded the finest fleet in the 6th Coronal Dynasty. Yet I stood there, paralyzed, while a human captain, a representative of a species I had mocked in open council only 3 days earlier, took command of my own bridge. 3 days, that was all it had taken for everything to change. 3 days earlier I had laughed at her. I had laughed at her stories. She had come aboard my flagship as part of the new human integration program, a diplomatic gesture the Grand Coalition had insisted upon after the humans proved useful in the border skirmishes near the Veldari Reach. I had argued against it. I had called it a waste. The humans were a young species, barely 300 years past their first atomic weapons, and they had very nearly been eliminated during their first contact with the HFY swarm. We had saved them. We had pulled their broken colony ships out of the dark and given them a place in our coalition as a favor, nothing more. And yet here was their liaison officer, standing on my command deck, presenting me with gifts. Not weapons, not technology, not star charts or resource agreements, books. She had brought me books. "These are the stories that shaped us, Lord Admiral," she had said, placing the data crystal gently on my council table. "We thought you might want to understand who we are before we fight beside you." I had laughed. I admit this without shame now, though shame is what I feel when I remember it. I had laughed in front of my entire senior staff. I had opened the crystal on the main display and read the first few titles aloud, my voice thick with amusement. The Stand at Thermopylae, I had read. The Alamo, The Siege of Stalingrad, Shackleton's Journey, The Battle of Rorke's Drift. I had looked at my officers. They had laughed with me. How could they not? "Captain Voss," I had said, turning back to her, "I have spent 3 days reviewing these documents, and I must say your species is quite remarkable. Not for the reasons you might hope. You are remarkable because you celebrate your failures. Every single one of these stories, every legend your people hold dear is about losing, about being outnumbered, about standing in hopeless positions against overwhelming forces, about dying for causes that could not be won." I had expected her to grow angry. Humans, I had been told, were emotional creatures, volatile, easily provoked. I had wanted to see it for myself. Instead, she had simply smiled. "My lord," she had said, "I think you have misread them." "Have I?" I had gestured at the display. 300 warriors against hundreds of thousands, all dead. A small fort in the middle of a desert surrounded and taken, all dead. A city starved for 900 days, millions dead. An expedition lost in the ice for 2 years. Tell me, Captain, which of these ended in victory? "None of them, Lord Admiral." Then why do you celebrate them? She had taken a long breath, and then she had said the words that I did not understand at the time, the words that I would come to understand far too late. We don't celebrate losing, my lord. We celebrate refusing to stop. I had waved her away. I had ordered her to return to her assigned quarters. I had made jokes about her after she left, and my officers had laughed politely, the way officers always do when their Lord Admiral makes a joke. That had been 3 days ago. Now she was kneeling beside my dying second in command, working to save his life, while the HFY closed in on my flagship from 3 directions. And I was standing there useless, because nothing in my 30,000 years of civilization had prepared me for what was happening. Lord Admiral, her voice cut through my paralysis, I need your authorization to redirect fleet command to the human auxiliary vessels. Our crews are immune to the spore weapon. Yours are not. I stared at her. The thought of handing command of a Zethari fleet to a human vessel was unthinkable. It violated every protocol, every tradition, every principle of noble rank that had governed our civilization since before humans had learned to smelt iron. Behind me, another of my officers collapsed. The spore weapon was working faster than our medical teams could respond. The entire coalition fleet was falling apart, ship by ship, bridge by bridge. Authorization granted, I said. The words tasted like poison. Captain Voss nodded once, and then she was in motion. She spoke into her wrist communicator in short, clipped sentences. Human commands. Human coordination. Within 60 seconds, the human auxiliary vessels, 62 ships that I had barely considered worth counting in my battle plans, had formed up into a defensive screen around the Zethari flagships. They moved with a speed and a precision that I had not believed possible from such a young species. The HFY hit them 3 minutes later. I watched from my bridge as the human ships absorbed the assault that should have destroyed my fleet. They did not fight the way we fought. They did not hold formation. They did not rely on the predictive engagement patterns that Zethari doctrine had perfected over hundreds of generations. They moved like nothing I had ever seen. Individual ships broke away to engage enemy vessels 3 times their size. Destroyers rammed cruisers. Fighter squadrons drove directly into enemy formations, scattering them through sheer chaos. It should not have worked. By every rule of warfare that I understood, it should have been suicide. It worked. The HFY advance stalled. Their hive coordination, which depended on predicting enemy behavior and overwhelming weak points, simply could not process what the humans were doing. The human ships made decisions that no rational commander would make, and in doing so, they created openings that no rational enemy could exploit. Captain Voss returned to my side. Admiral Threxel was stable, she reported. The human medical teams were moving through the ship, treating the afflicted crew members one by one. The spore weapon was survivable if treated within the first 15 minutes, and the humans had the treatments ready. How, I asked her, I could think of nothing else to say. How did you know? She looked at me for a long moment. The battle raged on around us, but for that moment, she gave me her full attention, and I understood that she was trying to decide whether to tell me the truth. Because we have fought this war before, my lord, she finally said. Not against the HFY, against many others, against ourselves mostly. We have been fighting impossible wars for a very, very long time, and we have learned a few things that older civilizations sometimes forget. I did not respond. I could not. She returned to her work, coordinating the human defense of my fleet, saving the lives of my crew, holding back an enemy that should have broken us within the hour. And I stood on my own bridge, a Lord Admiral of the 6th Coronal Dynasty, and I realized that I had been wrong about everything. The stories she had shown me were not fables. They were not sentimental tales of a young and foolish species. They were warnings, instructions, a manual for how to fight when fighting seems impossible, and I had laughed at them. I had laughed. The human ships held the line for the next 6 hours, until the HFY finally withdrew to regroup. By the time the battle ended, 41 of the 62 human vessels were damaged beyond repair. The crews had transferred to other ships during the fighting, sometimes through open space, sometimes by ramming abandoned friendly vessels to recover their bodies. They had lost 416 people. Not one human ship had retreated, not one. When Captain Voss finally stepped away from the command console, her uniform stained with 3 different colors of blood, none of it her own, she found me still standing where I had been 6 hours earlier. She said nothing. She simply nodded to me once, a human gesture of respect, and walked toward the lift to check on the wounded. I watched her go, and somewhere, deep in the oldest part of my mind, where the ancient instincts of my species still lived beneath 30,000 years of civilization, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt afraid of her. Not of her strength, not of her weapons, not of her ships. Of what she represented. Because if her stories were true, and now I knew they were, then I had been wrong about the nature of warfare itself. I had been wrong about what made a civilization strong. I had been wrong about everything my culture had taught me. And worse, so much worse, I had been wrong about humanity. The galaxy, I was beginning to suspect, was about to learn the same lesson I had just learned, and I did not know if any of us were ready for it. The HFY were regrouping. They would return, and when they did, the coalition would need to make a choice about how to meet them. The old doctrines had failed. The ancient wisdom had failed. The accumulated knowledge of 30,000 years had failed. We had only one path forward now, and that path had a human face. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my private chambers and I opened the data crystal Captain Voss had given me 3 days earlier, and I began to read. Not to mock, not to analyze, to learn. I read the story of 300 warriors at a mountain pass who had held back an empire for 3 days. I read of a small group of defenders at a desert fort who had given their lives to buy time for a new nation to form. I read of a city that had endured 900 days of siege, eating whatever they could find, refusing to surrender even as hundreds of thousands of their people perished. And I read of a ship trapped in the ice at the bottom of a frozen sea, and a captain named Shackleton who had refused, absolutely refused, to let a single member of his crew die. He had crossed impossible distances in a small boat. He had climbed mountains no one had ever climbed. He had walked back into the ice alone to rescue men he had left behind. And every single person under his command had come home alive. I read until the stars of my system began to rise outside my viewport, and when I finally closed the crystal, I understood what Captain Voss had meant. Humans did not celebrate losing. They celebrated the moment when losing was no longer an option, and they chose to stand anyway. That was the legend they had tried to give me, and I, in my arrogance, had laughed. The HFY would attack again within the week. Our intelligence analysts were certain of it. They were gathering a force 3 times the size of the one that had just failed to destroy us, and they were bringing weapons we had not yet seen. The Coalition War Council would convene tomorrow to decide our response. My voice, as Lord Admiral of the 6th Coronal Dynasty, would carry significant weight in that chamber. I would be expected to recommend a course of action. For the first time in my long career, I did not know what to say. But I knew, with absolute certainty, who I needed to speak with before that council convened. I keyed my personal communicator and requested an audience with Captain Alina Voss, not as a subordinate, not as a liaison officer, as an equal, as someone who knew things I did not know and who might, if I was fortunate, be willing to teach them to me. She responded within moments. She would meet me in my private dining chamber in 1 hour. I spent that hour preparing, not strategy, not arguments, questions. I wrote down every question I could think of, every assumption I had ever made about humanity that I now needed to verify, every gap in my understanding that the next war would expose. By the time she arrived, I had filled 12 pages. She sat across from me, and she saw the pages, and she smiled that small human smile. "Lord Admiral," she said, "I was wondering when you would be ready." And so we began. The intelligence reports came in just before dawn, and when I saw them, my hands began to shake. The HFY were not gathering 3 times the force we had faced. They were gathering 12 times. They were bringing their main war fleet, held in reserve for centuries, pulled from the deep dark between the galaxies. They were coming to end us, not to defeat us, to erase us. And they had chosen their point of attack, a narrow stellar corridor called the Meridian Line, the one passage through which reinforcements could reach the inner coalition worlds. If the Meridian Line fell, the war was over, not in months, in days. I brought the reports to the council chamber. I expected panic. I expected argument. I expected the old families to demand immediate withdrawal to the inner veil, the traditional last defense of Zethari civilization. Instead, Captain Voss stood up. "Lord Admiral," she said, "the Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet volunteers to hold the Meridian Line." The chamber fell silent, every eye turned to her. The Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet had 42 ships. The HFY were bringing 8,000. I looked at her, and I saw in her eyes something I recognized now, something I had read about in the stories, the same look that Leonidas must have worn at Thermopylae, the same look that Travis had at the Alamo, the same look that a quiet officer named Shackleton had given to his crew when he told them, against all reason, that every one of them would come home alive. "Captain Voss," I said slowly, "do you understand what you are asking?" "Yes, my lord." "The math is impossible." "The math has been impossible before, my lord." "You cannot hold that line." She met my eyes, and she said the words that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. "My lord, we are not going there to hold the line. We are going there to make certain they remember what it cost them." I tried to object. I tried to order her to withdraw the offer. I tried, in that moment, to protect her in the only way I knew how. But the other human representatives were standing now, one after another. 42 human captains, rising from their seats, each one volunteering their ship, their crew, their lives, for a battle that could not be won. And the worst part, the part that shattered something inside me that has never fully healed, was this. They were not afraid. I looked at 42 human officers standing in my council chamber, each of them knowing that they were volunteering to die, and not one of them was afraid. And I understood then what I should have understood 3 days earlier, when a young captain had laid a data crystal on my table and tried to tell me who her people truly were. The humans had not come to our coalition as junior partners. They had not come as refugees or as auxiliaries or as a species seeking protection. They had come as teachers. And now, whether I was ready or not, the lesson was about to begin. The Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet departed for the Meridian Line at 1500 hours ship time. I stood in the observation deck of the Crown of Seven Suns and watched 42 small vessels accelerate toward what every strategic model in our database predicted would be their complete destruction. Captain Voss commanded the lead ship, a destroyer called the Perseverance. Before she left my flagship, she came to my private chambers one last time. She brought with her a small object, a flat piece of metal with an image etched into it. A photograph, she called it. It showed a group of humans standing together, smiling, their arms around each other. "My crew, Lord Admiral," she said. "The ones I left behind on Earth when I volunteered for this assignment. My husband, my 2 children, my parents, my sister." "Why do you show me this?" I asked. "Because you need to understand something." She set the photograph on my desk. "We are not legends, my lord. We are not heroes from ancient stories. We are ordinary people. We have families. We have fears. We love our lives, and we do not want to die." "Then why?" She smiled, and her eyes were wet with something I now knew was not weakness. It was the weight of choice. The weight of knowing exactly what you were about to lose and choosing to lose it anyway because something else mattered more. "Because, my lord, if we do not stand now, then someone else will have to stand later, and they may not have the stories to teach them how." She left the photograph on my desk. She saluted me, a human salute, the formal kind reserved for superior officers, and then she was gone. I stood at the observation port as her fleet accelerated into the dark. 42 small points of light growing smaller, disappearing. I did not know it then, but I was watching the moment history turned. The moment when everything I thought I knew about the universe stopped being true. The Battle of the Meridian Line would begin in 71 hours, and what happened there would rewrite the war. It would rewrite my civilization. It would rewrite me. But before any of that, 42 ships had to fly into the dark and stand against 8,000. And somehow, against every rule I had ever known, they had to find a way to make the impossible hold. The HFY main fleet emerged from their transit jump at 0600 hours, local stellar time, and the scale of what appeared on our long-range scanners was something that I had never seen in 3 centuries of command. 8,000 vessels, a formation that stretched across 11 light seconds of space. At its center, 6 capital ships larger than anything in the Coalition arsenal, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce a planet to dust. And between them and the inner worlds of the Coalition stood 42 human ships. I watched the tactical display in the war room of my flagship, 12 jumps behind the Meridian Line, because that was as close as the Council had permitted me to be. The humans had insisted on this. They did not want senior Coalition officers close enough to be lost if the line collapsed. Captain Voss had argued for it personally. "If we fail, my lord," she had said, "the Coalition will need you. The people who lead next should not be the people who were here." She had not said if we die, she had said if we fail. The distinction mattered to her. The first contact came at 0617 minutes. The HFY Vanguard, 200 heavy cruisers, accelerated toward the human formation at attack speed. On my display, the 42 human ships spread out into a pattern I did not recognize. It was not any formation in our tactical manuals. It was not any formation in theirs either. They had invented something new. The human ships scattered, but they did not flee. Each vessel took up a position that looked random, chaotic, until I saw what was actually happening. They were creating overlapping fields of fire that could not be predicted by enemy sensors. Every time a HFY cruiser locked onto a target, 3 other human ships would open fire from unexpected angles, forcing the enemy to recalculate constantly. It was like watching a swarm of small birds defend themselves against a larger predator. Individually, each bird was helpless. Together, moving as a living system, they became something the predator could not catch. The first HFY cruiser fell within 4 minutes. My senior intelligence officer, Commander Yelkath, stood beside me with her recording equipment running. Every action the humans took was being documented, every decision, every moment. We had agreed, all of us in the senior command, that whatever happened out there, we needed to learn from it. If the humans were going to teach us how to fight, we would not waste the lesson. The HFY Vanguard suffered 27 losses in the first 30 minutes. They had expected to break through the human formation in less than 10. Their commanders, whatever minds guided that hive, began to shift tactics. They brought up the main fleet. 8,000 ships moved as one toward 42. I watched the red mass of the HFY formation swell across my display, swallowing the tiny blue dots that represented the Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. And the human ships did not retreat. They did not break formation. They did not scatter. They advanced. I nearly dropped my command stylus. On the tactical display, the 42 human ships accelerated directly into the advancing HFY fleet, not around it, not through gaps in the formation, directly at the center mass of the enemy armada. "What are they doing?" Commander Yelkath whispered beside me. "What are they doing?" I knew what they were doing, though I could barely bring myself to say it. "They are not trying to hold the line," I said quietly. "They are trying to break it." The human ships plunged into the HFY formation like a blade into soft flesh. They did not stop at the outer edge. They did not hold position and fire from range. They drove deeper and deeper still into the heart of the enemy fleet, and the HFY could not respond because their weapons were optimized for long-range engagement. Up close, inside their own formation, they could not fire without hitting each other. The humans had known this. Somehow they had known. The Perseverance, Captain Voss's destroyer, was leading the charge. I watched her ship drive past two HFY cruisers and engage a command vessel at point-blank range. The command vessel tried to withdraw, but other HFY ships blocked its escape, and the Perseverance destroyed it with a full spread of torpedoes fired from less than 500 meters. The effect on the HFY formation was immediate. With their local command vessel gone, the ships in that sector lost coordination. They began to fire wildly. Some of them fired at each other. "She is breaking them from the inside," Commander Yelkath said. Her voice was shaking. "Lord Admiral, she is breaking them from the inside." I could only nod. I could not speak. The battle at the Meridian Line lasted 72 hours. In that time, the 42 ships of the Terran Third Expeditionary Fleet destroyed 411 HFY vessels, including 3 of the 6 capital ships. They disrupted the enemy formation so completely that the HFY were forced to break off their advance and regroup at a distance of 6 light hours, where they spent the next 2 days trying to re-establish their coordination. In those 2 days, the Coalition Relief Fleet arrived. 1,200 ships, enough firepower to engage the HFY on terms we could actually win. But that is not the story that matters. That is not the story that changed everything. The story that changed everything is what happened to the Perseverance in the final hours of the battle. By that point, only 7 human ships were still fighting. The other 35 had been either destroyed or damaged beyond combat capability. The surviving crews had transferred to the remaining vessels, packed into every available compartment, loading torpedoes by hand because the automated systems were failing, pouring water on overheated power cores, refusing to stop. Captain Voss had transferred her command 3 times. Her first ship, the Perseverance, had been destroyed. Her second, a frigate called the Morrigan, had been destroyed. She was now aboard a corvette called the Harrow, the smallest ship in the fleet, and she was still giving orders. The HFY made one final push. 200 surviving cruisers, attempting to break past the remaining human ships before the Coalition Relief Fleet arrived. If they succeeded, they could still reach the inner worlds. The humans had to hold them for another 47 minutes. They held for 60. When the Coalition Relief Fleet arrived, 3 human ships were still functional. 3 out of the original 42. The Harrow was one of them. Captain Voss was still at her command station, her right arm in a field splint, her face streaked with blood, her voice hoarse from giving orders. I boarded the Harrow myself 3 hours after the HFY withdrawal. I had ordered my personal shuttle prepared the moment the battle ended, and I had traveled directly to the debris field of the Meridian Line, accompanied only by my personal staff and a medical team. Captain Voss met me at the airlock. She was standing, though I could see the effort it cost her. She saluted me, her left hand because her right arm was no longer functional. "Lord Admiral," she said, "we held the line." I looked at her. I looked past her, at the interior of the Harrow, at the exhausted men and women sitting along the walls, at the wounded being tended to by their own comrades, because the medical bay had been repurposed as an ammunition store halfway through the battle. I looked at the blood, and the damage, and the faces. And I understood that I was looking at something my civilization had never produced and might never produce. I looked at legends, living, breathing legends, the kind that old civilizations tell stories about to frighten their children into bravery, the kind that young civilizations tell stories about to teach their children what is possible. I could not speak for a long moment. When I finally found my voice, the words that came out were not the words I had prepared. They were much simpler. "Captain Voss," I said, "I do not know how to thank you." She looked at me, and her exhausted face softened into something like a smile. "My lord," she said, "you do not have to thank us, you just have to remember." "Remember what?" "Remember that it can be done. Remember that when someone tells you the numbers are impossible, the math does not matter, the situation is hopeless, you can choose. You can always choose. You can stand or you can run. That is the only real decision in any fight. Everything else is just details. I stared at her. Tell your people that, my lord. Teach them that. Because someday you will need to stand and we will not be there to stand with you. And when that day comes, you will need to know that it can be done. I nodded slowly. I could not do anything else. Behind her, a young human officer approached with a medical scanner. He was no older than 25 human years. He had a bandage wrapped around his head, and his uniform was soaked through with someone else's blood. When he saw me, he straightened up and saluted. "Sir," he said. His voice was shaking, but his back was straight. "With respect, the captain needs medical treatment. She has been refusing it for 6 hours." Captain Voss turned to him. "Ensign Marcus Holloway," she said, "have the wounded all been treated?" "Most of them, ma'am. But you are also wounded, and you are the commanding officer, and doctrine says. Doctrine says the captain goes last. Every other wounded person on this ship, ensign, every single one, then me." The young ensign looked at me, pleading silently. I understood what he wanted. He wanted me to order her to accept treatment. He wanted me to use my authority as Lord Admiral to overrule her. I looked at Captain Voss. I looked at the determination in her face, the quiet certainty that had carried her through 72 hours of a battle that no one in the galaxy had believed she could survive. And I understood that my authority meant nothing here. This was her ship, this was her crew, this was her choice. "Ensign Holloway," I said, "please continue treating the wounded. I will remain with Captain Voss until she is ready." The young man nodded and went back to his work. I stood with her for another 4 hours, while her crew was tended to, while the Harrow drifted among the wreckage of a battle that my people would study for centuries. We did not speak much. We did not need to. Sometimes understanding does not require words. When the last of the wounded had been treated, and only then, Captain Alina Voss finally allowed the medical team to examine her. She had 3 broken ribs, a shattered arm, a concussion, and a wound in her side that should have killed her 6 hours earlier. She survived. She was a human. Survival was what they did. As I returned to my shuttle to go back to the Crown of 7 Suns, I stopped at the airlock and looked back one more time. Captain Voss was lying on a medical stretcher, being prepared for transport to a proper medical facility, and she raised her good hand in a small wave. I raised my hand in return, the Zethary gesture of equals, the gesture I had been taught from my earliest youth to offer only to those of my own rank and bloodline. Her eyes widened slightly. She understood what I was telling her. She was not our junior partner anymore. She was not our auxiliary. She was not a representative of a young species under our protection. She was my equal. They all were, and they had earned that equality in a way that no species in the history of the Coalition had ever done before. I returned to my flagship and I called an emergency session of the Grand Council. I had a proposal to make, and this time I was not going to laugh. The Grand Council chamber had been built 4,000 years ago, carved from the heart of a single mountain on the Zethary homeworld. Its walls were lined with the banners of every species that had ever joined our coalition, and its floor was inlaid with a map of every star system under our protection. It was the oldest continuous governing body in this arm of the galaxy, and in all its history, no junior species had ever been elevated to full partner status. There were procedures for it. The procedures had never been used. I was about to use them. Every seat in the chamber was filled. Every senior representative of every coalition species had come, because word of the Meridian Line had spread through our territories with a speed that our communications networks could barely keep pace with. 42 ships had held back 8,000. The humans had done it. And now the Lord Admiral of the 6th Coronal Dynasty was calling a full council session, and everyone knew why. I stood at the central platform, and I let the silence stretch for a long moment before I spoke. "My brothers and sisters of the Coalition," I began, "3 days ago, the Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet did something that our most advanced strategic models had calculated as impossible. You have all seen the reports. You have all reviewed the combat recordings. You know, as I know, What happened at the meridian line? A murmur ran through the chamber. I waited for it to subside. I am here today to make a formal proposal. The humans of Earth, currently classified as a junior auxiliary species within our coalition, are to be elevated to full partner status, with voting rights and command authority equal to the founding species. I am further proposing that a new military doctrine, based on human combat principles, be adopted as the standard combat philosophy of coalition forces across all services. The chamber erupted. I had expected this. I stood silently, letting the objections wash over me, waiting for the moment when the noise would settle enough that reason could be heard again. Lord Regent Calivan of the Thyrek Accord was the first to speak in opposition, as I had known he would be. Lord Admiral Talmera, he said, his voice carrying the cold precision that had made him famous in 3 centuries of council debate, I do not question the valor of the humans at the meridian line. It was a remarkable action, but you are asking this council to overturn 4,000 years of established protocol on the basis of a single engagement. One battle does not rewrite a civilization. I nodded slowly. Lord Regent, I said, you are correct. One battle does not rewrite a civilization, but one battle can reveal what a civilization already is. And what the meridian line revealed about the humans, about us, about our war, is something that we cannot afford to ignore. I turned slowly, addressing the entire chamber. I stood on the bridge of my flagship and watched our fleet fall to a weapon we had not anticipated. Our doctrine failed us. Our predictive models failed us. Our ancient wisdom, accumulated over 30,000 years of warfare, failed us. And when it failed, it was the humans who saved us. Not with superior technology, not with greater numbers, with something else, something that our civilization has forgotten. I paused. I had their attention now. The humans fight differently because they think differently. They do not accept the impossibility of a situation. They do not calculate the cost of defeat and adjust their behavior accordingly. They do something that every strategic mind in this chamber has been trained to consider irrational. They decide in advance that they will not stop. And then, having decided, they find ways to make that decision true. Another murmur, I continued. This is not a tactic. This is not a battle technique that can be taught in a training module. This is a way of being, a way of approaching the universe that I now believe our species has lost. And unless we regain it, we will not survive what is coming. Lord Regent Calivan leaned forward. What is coming, Lord Admiral? I met his eyes. The HFY will return, not with 8,000 ships, with 20,000, with 40,000. They have infinite numbers. They have infinite time. And our current doctrine, the doctrine that has served us for 4,000 years, cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy that does not know how to stop. And the humans can. The humans, Lord Regent, do not know how to stop either. That is the point. I let that settle into the chamber. 4,000 years ago, I continued. When our civilization was younger and harder, we knew this truth. Our ancestors stood at Velkorath. Our founders died holding the Crescent Straits. We were once the civilization that refused to stop. We have forgotten what we were. The humans, who have never forgotten, are here to remind us. Commander Threxil, recovered now from the spore weapon and present in the chamber, rose from his seat. Lord Admiral, he said, I second the motion. One by one, the senior military officers of every coalition species stood. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to shift the balance. Enough to make the vote close where it would otherwise have been a foregone conclusion of denial. When the vote was called, the motion passed. Not unanimously, not even overwhelmingly, but it passed. The humans were elevated. The new doctrine was adopted. A new era of the coalition had begun, and I had been the one to begin it. I left the chamber that day feeling something I had not felt in many years. I felt young again. I felt as though I had been handed a gift, the gift of seeing my civilization clearly for the first time, and the chance to change its direction before it was too late. The war against the HFY continued for another 6 years. In that time, The new doctrine, which we came to call Velshikar, the Standing Flame, spread through every branch of the coalition military. Young officers trained in human combat philosophy. Old officers like myself learned to see our tactics differently. The humans were no longer auxiliaries. They fought alongside us as equals, and their presence changed everything. Captain Alina Voss, promoted to Fleet Admiral after the Meridian Line, became one of the primary architects of our new way of war. She traveled to the Zethari homeworld. She addressed our academies. She wrote treatises that were translated into every coalition language. She became, in her quiet and unassuming way, one of the most influential military thinkers our alliance had ever known. And the HFY, who had believed they were fighting a predictable, doctrine-bound enemy, found themselves facing something new, something they could not model, something that, even when outnumbered and outgunned, refused to behave the way their hive mind expected. The war turned, slowly at first and then with gathering speed. Battle after battle, system after system, we pushed them back. The HFY swarm, which had threatened to end the coalition forever, began to fracture. Their hive coordination, which had always been their greatest strength, became their greatest weakness when they could not predict what we would do. In the 7th year of the war, their main fleet collapsed in on itself during a battle at the Tendril Nebula. The different colonies attacking each other because their central command had lost the ability to coordinate them against an enemy that refused to follow rules. The war ended not with a single dramatic victory, but with a slow, grinding realization on the part of our enemies that they could not win. They withdrew to the edges of known space to lick their wounds and wait for whatever might come next. We did not pursue them. We had learned too much about the cost of endless war. We chose, instead, to build. 15 years after the Meridian Line, I stood on the monument world that had been built to honor the 42 ships of the Terran 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. The planet had been terraformed specifically for this purpose, a small world in neutral space, its surface covered in gardens and memorial structures. At the center stood a great stone circle, each stone carved with the name of one of the human ships that had fought in that battle. At the center of the circle, on a low platform, were the names of every individual human who had lost their life in those 72 hours. 416 names, each one carved by hand, by a Zethari craftsman who had volunteered for the work. Fleet Admiral Alina Voss stood beside me. She was older now. Her hair had turned gray. She walked with a cane, a legacy of the wounds she had taken at the Meridian Line, the wounds that had never fully healed. She was, by human measure, nearing the end of her life. Zethari lived longer than humans, and I had known when I first met her that I would see her pass. I had not expected it to affect me so deeply. We walked slowly through the monument garden, not speaking, reading the names. When we reached the central platform, she stopped and looked up at the stars. "Lord Admiral," she said, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course, Fleet Admiral." "When I came aboard your flagship with that data crystal, all those years ago, with those stories that you laughed at, did you ever imagine that any of this would happen?" I considered her question for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I could not have imagined any of it. When I looked at you then, I saw a young officer from a young species trying to share something that I did not believe was worth sharing. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." "You were not wrong about everything, Lord Admiral. You were wrong about one thing, and you changed your mind. That is more than most beings in this galaxy ever manage." I turned to her. "Fleet Admiral, may I ask you a question in return?" "Please." "When you first came aboard my ship, did you know? Did you know that we would need your stories? That the war would turn the way it did? That your people would rise to the place they have risen to in the coalition?" She smiled, that small human smile I had come to know so well. "No, Lord Admiral, I did not know any of that. I simply knew that somewhere, at some point, someone is always going to need those stories. That has been true throughout our history, and I expected it to be true in our future. So we keep telling them, not because we know when they will be needed, but because we know that they will be." I looked at her for a long time. "Fleet Admiral," I said, Your species has given my species a gift greater than any in our history. I do not think any of us will ever be able to repay it." "Oh, Lord Admiral," she laughed softly, "you misunderstand as you did the first time. This was not a gift. This was an exchange. You have given us something in return." "What have we given you?" "You gave us belonging. You gave us a place in a galaxy that was older and wiser than us, and you treated us eventually as equals. We had been alone for a very long time before we met your coalition. For most of our history, we have been alone on our single small world, fighting each other, dying in plagues, starving in famines, struggling through 1,000 generations of darkness just to get to the point where we could reach the stars. And when we finally reached the stars, we were nearly eliminated by enemies we did not understand. And then you came, and you gave us a chance to be part of something larger than ourselves." She turned to me, and her eyes were bright. "Lord Admiral, do not thank us for teaching you how to fight. Thank you for teaching us that we were not alone. That is a gift that dwarfs any other." I did not know how to respond to that. I simply nodded, and we continued walking. Fleet Admiral Elena Voss passed away 2 years later, in her sleep in her home on Earth, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 78 years old, a long life by human standards, though short by mine. I attended her funeral. I traveled to Earth personally, the first Lord Admiral of the 6th Coronal Dynasty to ever set foot on a human world. I stood beside her family as she was laid to rest, and I delivered the words that her family had asked me to deliver, the words we had agreed upon years before when we had first spoken of her eventual death. I spoke of a young officer who had come aboard my flagship with a data crystal full of stories. I spoke of a Lord Admiral who had laughed at those stories, and who had learned too late that they were not stories at all, but warnings and instructions, and a map of what it means to be a species worth saving. I spoke of the Meridian Line, and of 42 ships that had refused to stop. I spoke of the years that had followed, and the war that had turned, and the new coalition that had risen from the ashes of the old. And then I spoke of her, not as a legend, not as a hero, but as a friend who had, over the course of many years, taught me what my own civilization had forgotten, and who had given me, in my final decades, the opportunity to be a better version of the being I had once been. When the service ended, her daughter, a woman in her 40s with her mother's eyes, approached me. She was holding something small, a flat piece of metal, worn with age, a photograph. "Lord Admiral," she said, "my mother wanted you to have this. She said you would understand." I took the photograph carefully. It was the same image she had shown me 20 years earlier in my private chambers aboard the Crown of Seven Suns, on the day she had left for the Meridian Line. Her family, her husband now gone many years, her children now grown with children of their own, her parents and her sister, all of whom had passed during the intervening decades. I understood what she was telling me. Across time, across the gulf between her life and mine, she was saying to me what she had said on the day she left for battle. "We are not legends. We are ordinary people, and the ordinary people are the ones who change everything." I keep the photograph on my desk now. I have served as Lord Admiral for another 18 years since her passing, and I will serve for many more before my own time ends. I have become, in my long final years, one of the strongest advocates for the full integration of humanity into every level of coalition life. I have championed their inclusion in the oldest councils. I have supported the establishment of human worlds as coalition capitals. I have, in my small way, tried to repay a debt that cannot ever truly be repaid. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the stars outside my observation port burn cold and white against the dark, I take down that photograph and I look at it. I think about a young captain who came aboard my flagship with a data crystal full of stories that I did not want to hear. I think about the battle at the Meridian Line and the 42 ships that held the line not by holding, but by advancing. I think about a friend I did not deserve, who gave me lessons I had not earned, who changed my life and my civilization in ways I could not have imagined when I first laughed at her. And I think about the stars that humanity stood for, the stars that humanity bled for, the stars that, because of 42 ships and 416 names carved in stone on a small monument world, are still here, still burning, still waiting for the next species that will need to hear the stories, and the species after that, and the species after that, until the end of time. galaxy does not belong to the strong. It does not belong to the ancient. It does not belong to the wise or the wealthy or the well-armed. It belongs to those who refuse to stop. I learned this lesson from a young human captain who came aboard my ship with a data crystal and who taught me over many years what my civilization had forgotten and what hers had never let itself forget. I close my log now, as I've closed it every night for the last 40 years, with the words that she gave me, the words I now believe are the truest any being has ever spoken. I laughed at their legends. Then I watched one rewrite the war. And I learned in my final years that the galaxy does not belong to the strong or the ancient or the wise. It belongs to them. It has always belonged to them.